It is true that I am not one of the soothing economists, but it is also true that some of what may formerly have been known as the neoclassical economists have been changing their spots, particularly over the last few months. And I suppose there is a growing frustration within the economics community, and there's a growing frustration, particularly amongst younger economists, at the obvious failures of the current understandings or the current shibboleths or paradigm that is articulated to us. So one of the major strands in terms of attempting to move economics forward, and it's interesting insofar as this has been promoted to a certain extent by some of the factions within the IMF itself, is the understanding that first of all monetary policy has to go beyond price stability. We all know this, at least within this room, and I'm not going to dwell upon that because that's been dealt with very successfully this morning, and I'm going to look at some of the other areas instead. What's also become apparent, and again this was dealt with this morning to a very successful degree, and so I'm not going to focus on it to a great extent either, is that the Eurozone clearly has inherent problems of fragility, and that monetary policy without fiscal federalism is essentially incoherent. You can have a one-size-fits-all interest rate when you have fiscal federalism in the way that the United States does, but that model simply isn't appropriate for Europe as it exists. And the ultimate implication for this is that the status quo cannot maintain, and that either the Eurozone will have to break up or it will have to move in the direction of fiscal federalism. So what's been happening to macro theory? What's changing? There is an increasing understanding of the importance of regulation and agency theory, and there is an increasing understanding of the importance of behavioral economics. But alongside those two trends, there's also the reawakening of the understanding of the importance of fiscal policy. Previously, as was articulated again this morning, the orthodox consensus, this is your neoclassical economists that were described, the consensus was that we just needed to rely on monetary policy. And there was a feeling that the zero lower bound on interest rates would only rarely bind. But in fact, what we're finding through an increasing body of empirical work is that fiscal policy is in fact important. Now this seems obvious, but it wasn't considered obvious within the economics profession, particularly in the 1980s, 1990s, and the early part of the previous decade. In fact, to go back to NUI Galway and the soothing economists, I was told once by one of my more esteemed professors, and indeed a man who I greatly respect, that really there was nothing more to economics. It was over now. There was really no point becoming an economist because we'd figured it all out. I think it's pretty apparent that that's not the case, and although it's a terrible time for the world economy, it's actually quite an exciting time to be an economist as we pick over the entrails and try and figure out where we went wrong. It is true that the multiplier is context dependent, and it's also true that it's very, very difficult to generate counterfactuals, particularly in Europe, where the institutional architecture of the different countries is so different. Really, the only examples that we can truly look at would be individual states within, say, the USA, where one state might initiate a fiscal stimulus, whereas an adjoining state with very, very similar characteristics may choose not to do so. But nonetheless, we are developing tools that allow us to measure multipliers. So even the IMF, and remember this is the IMF, which is part of the Troika, is advocating that Ireland engage in a massive process of extreme austerity, has itself recently held a conference And one of the topics within that conference was the importance of fiscal policy. And a key finding within that conference was that fiscal consolidation was very, very damaging to the economy. And I'll look at some numbers later on. What they also find is that when monetary policy is constrained, as it is for Ireland, consolidations have particularly painful macroeconomic costs. So it's amplified, it's even more severe. Alongside this, they've also looked at the theory of expansionary fiscal contraction, which it is now accepted within the IMF itself, and remember this is one of the organizations that is advocating austerity for Ireland, that there were methodological flaws associated with the underpinnings of that original theory. Finally, fiscal space is valuable, it is important, and not having fiscal space constrains stimulus when you don't have access to the ability to devalue your currency, which again is important for Ireland. Again, the issues with monetary, with the design flaws in monetary union were well picked over this morning, but one thing I would like to reiterate again is that centralizing monetary policy while keeping the other instruments of economic policy in member hands is essentially incoherent. You either jump in with both feet or you don't go in at all. To try and combine both is essentially incoherent and cannot work. And again, the implication is that either the euro breaks up or there will have to be greater moves towards fiscal federalism. Okay, what else have we learned? And again, this is very important. It was there was a movement in the 1980s and 1990s towards increasing deregulation. Well, what we found, or what the economics profession has found, and in a sense it already knew this, it simply ignored it and took the attitude that, in fact, we've gone beyond that, we've learned the lessons, we know what the previous mistakes were, and we can avoid them this time. And what we found is that even from the famous Reinhardt and Rogoff, who are two economists noted for their fiscal hawkishness, but what they've also found is that periods of high international capital mobility have repeatedly produced international banking crises. And this has happened continuously over the last century plus. And they've also identified, Kaminsky and Reinhardt, that there are strong links between crises and financial liberalization. So regulation, again, is back. So what is the current European strategy? Well, it's essentially got 5 basic pieces. The first is that there's a creation of a new fiscal oversight and supervisory mechanism system. Second is there's been the creation of new mechanisms to fund loan facilities. This is the EFSF and the ESM, which will be the permanent institution that will replace it in 2013. There's been the extension of loan facilities to fiscally troubled member states, the famous PIGS. Fourth of all, there's been conditionality of austerity policies on fiscally troubled members in return for the receipt of this loan funding. So so austerity is conditional upon receiving or obtaining access to these loans. And fifth of all, and this isn't actually in any official documents, but it's a stance that has been adopted, which is the prohibition on private sector bail-in, which is the famous no bondholder left behind policy. We couldn't possibly do anything to the banking system. They're very delicate. Now, unfortunately, it's essentially been amateur hour from the official bodies from the very, very beginning. There has been a lack of understanding of the crisis itself. Initially, it was believed, certainly within Central Europe, that the key issue was one of competitiveness, that the PIGS, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, had essentially lost competitiveness. But as you can see here, as a proportion of exports of goods and services, the graphs barely change at all over the last 10 years for any of these four countries. So to say that the issue has been one of competitiveness is certainly not backed up by the raw figures. Now, what's happened in Ireland? Well, we all know. So far we've had a discretionary fiscal tightening of 14.6 billion, which is equivalent to 9.3% of 2010's GDP. This is one of the greatest consolidations in Western history since World War II. We're now told that there's a requirement for a further 15 billion in discretionary fiscal tightening because seemingly we haven't applied enough leeches so far. And essentially this four-year plan was then adopted as the basis for the fiscal component of the EU-IMF deal, although it is widely reported that the IMF acknowledges that the plan is unworkable, and indeed the IMF's own publications allude to it obliquely on numerous occasions, talking about how growth projections are overly optimistic, talking about the effects of fiscal consolidation and so on and so forth. So we're told that the fiscal austerity package will stabilise our debt to GDP ratio at 124% of GDP in 2014. Now, in terms of what we are expected to do, or what they wish us to do, to achieve mastery compliance 60% of GDP, if we look at the numbers, so let's say the interest rate is 1% higher than the growth rate of nominal GDP, what does that actually mean? It means a tightening the structural primary fiscal deficit between 2009 and 2020 will require Ireland to adjust by between 14 and 16% of GDP, which in 2010 numbers is equivalent to around 24 billion. And it's even higher for Greece. So essentially, they're advocating extreme austerity of a type which has only been experienced by countries like Latvia since World War II in terms of Western countries. So what is it? So let's look at the IMF's own numbers. What are they actually telling us? What do they find from their meta-analysis? Well, they find that consolidation typically has a contractionary effect in output. They find that a fiscal consolidation equal to 1% of GDP typically reduces GDP by about 0.5% within 2 years and will raise the unemployment rate by about 0.3 percentage points. Domestic demand, of course, falls by the greatest amount, and the assumption is that net exports will increase, and it is because net exports are expected to increase as a general stylized fact that the consolidation of 1% only reduces GDP by about 0.5%. So the assumption here would be net exports will increase because no other country is consolidating. You're doing this by yourself. But what's also found, and again this isn't just the IMF, but it's pretty much across the literature now, is that austerity is likely to be more painful if it occurs simultaneously across many countries, and also if monetary policy is not in a position to offset them. So monetary policy will not be in a position for Ireland, and our neighbours are engaging in austerity as well. So if interest rates are near zero, the effect of fiscal consolidation is more costly in terms of output. And because not all countries can increase net exports at the same time, fiscal contraction is likely to be more painful when many countries adjust. So remember, we're talking about a reduction or a fiscal consolidation of 14 to 16% of GDP. We're finding that fiscal consolidation of 1% reduces GDP by about a half, but in fact, if you remove the variable of net exports, which is contingent upon your neighbours not contracting as well, that 0.5% of GDP rises to 1% of GDP. So the consolidation that the IMF and the rest of the Troika is advocating for Ireland will, all things being equal, reduce Ireland's GDP by between 14 and 16%. So what happens now? Well, Greece is certainly insolvent and will have to restructure its debt. Greece will come first. It's even more extreme for now. In fact, it's happening as we speak. Greece will not reach the end of the year without some form of restructuring, and this is not a bad thing. The earlier this happens, the better. The longer you delay, the more you make private sector bail-in more difficult. So Greece won't be able to return to the markets. They won't be able to return to the markets in 2013, and they probably won't be able to return to the markets in 2015. and they're going to require further loans. So what's going to happen is they're first of all going to attempt a soft rescheduling, and this will be similar to the Uruguayan experience in 2003. What they'll try and do is they'll try and move the maturities out by 5 years or perhaps even longer. And that might be appropriate if it was a liquidity problem for the Greeks, but in fact, of course, it isn't. And this will simply be another fail policy. Ultimately, there will have to be a major write-down of Greece's debt. It is bankrupt. And there is no point denying it when we're only doing more damage by denying it. But for Ireland, it's all about the banks. Even without the banks, we would still have a large deficit. We'd have a debt-to-GDP ratio in the region of 80% of GDP, and we'd also have a sovereign wealth fund in the region of 15% of GDP. This is not ideal. We still have a large fiscal deficit, but it would be sustainable. So the major implication from this is, although we certainly need to identify an alternative to the austerity policies and look at what's feasible in terms of an investment strategy. But we also have to decouple the banking debt from the sovereign debt. And really we're talking about the vast bulk of the banking debt. We're not even just talking about the Anglo-IMBS money, although that would be where you would begin. As for the manageability of the crisis, it is manageable. Greece, Ireland and Portugal are just 6% of Eurozone GDP. And overall Eurozone public debt is itself only 84% of GDP, with an overall fiscal deficit of 6%. These numbers are both better than the US equivalents. The difference, of course, is that the US, as it needs to do so, can print money. But manageability hinges on Spain. Spanish solvency in turn hinges on the scale of Spanish banking debt. And certainly what we're being told is that the scale of the Spanish banking crisis is multiples of what we're being told officially, and that if the numbers are as large as are being circulated amongst the markets, that essentially Spain may itself also be insolvent. What about the European Central Bank? Well, the insistence that creditors to insolvent banks be paid in full by a third-party group, that is to say the Irish public, is certainly beyond its legal mandate. And there is nothing in any document, there's nothing in the Memorandum of Understanding that insists that Ireland should pay these debts. It is simply an imposition by the European Central Bank. What about the contention that the ECB will pull the plug on the Irish banking system if we decide to let the corpse banks collapse? No, it won't. That will immediately precipitate a European-wide banking crisis. It won't happen. Their bluff can be called in that. Where do we start? We start with the promissory notes. These will amount to 43 billion by 2023. It's approximately 3 billion next year and 3 billion the year after. And certainly one thing to recapitalise banks that may have a viable future, that could be regarded as an investment, but it is simply madness to continue to pay 3 billion plus a year for a dead bank. It would be far more prudent to put that money into some form of an investment strategy along the lines of the Economic Recovery Fund proposed by TASC. So we should seek to walk away. We should seek to walk away from all of the bank debt, knowing that we won't be able to walk away from all of it. That our initial negotiating position is to walk away from all of it. And I apologise for the typo there, but there is certainly a need for a good bank or an SME bank along the lines of the ICC that can provide liquidity for small and medium enterprises. What about escaping the bank guarantee? Well, Article 6 of our Constitution says that all powers of government, legislative, executive, derive from the people whose right it is to designate the rulers of the state and the final ability to decide all questions of national policy according to the requirements of the common good. All questions of national policy according to the requirements of the common good. I include this slide because Patrick Honohan said yesterday that there were no legal options open to Ireland and that they had tried. This clearly isn't the case. The Irish state, if indeed it is sovereign, does have the right to repudiate the bank guarantee in the interests of the common good. And just to conclude, without a sea change in policy, this particular story ends with a disorderly default. The longer we delay, the greater the cost to the Irish European taxpayer. The EU IMF loan facility is part of the problem, and the design of the ESM is actually increasing peripheral fragility for various technical reasons. Sadly, I don't have time to go into here. But the bank debt must be decoupled from the sovereign debt. Minnesota would not be expected to bail out the creditors to its banks. The bank debt is ultimately the ECB's responsibility, or it is simply just allowed to let go, but ECB, as European Central Bank, just stays behind it or not. It's a decision. Austerity has failed. And what's actually required is a new Marshall Plan equivalent for Europe. We're talking about Portugal, Greece, certainly Ireland, and the alternative to doing so is prolonged stagnation. Ultimately, the status quo cannot maintain, and the Eurozone will have to break up, or it will have to embrace the tenets of fiscal federalism, and all that entails. Okay.
Thank you, and I want to thank TASC for inviting me here to speak. For the next 20 minutes, I want to provide as concrete an outline of an alternative to the austerity policies that the Fianna Fáil government pursued, and which it appears the new government is intent on continuing. And that alternative can be summed up as an investment-based alternative. The Irish recession was driven by a collapse in investment, an unprecedented collapse in investment. In the last 3 years, we see that while the GDP fell in real terms by 22 billion euros, investment fell by an even greater amount, 27 billion. And that the impact on employment, wages, emigration, along with putting the fear in consumers, meant that consumer spending fell as well, about 9%. By the way, consumer spending has fallen at 10 times the rate of the Eurozone average over the last 3 years. Our problem certainly has not been a collapse in external demand. Our net exports have increased during that period. To put it in a European context, investment in Ireland has fallen by nearly 3/4, 75%, in the 5 years up to 2012. That's a projection. The Eurozone investment is expected to fall about 2%. 2.5%. And I just make this point, Eurozone investment is growing. It's growing this year, it's growing next year, it's recovering. Our investment levels are still falling. And if we're lucky, it'll flatline next year. So the recession was caused by a collapse in domestic demand, driven by, as I say, an unprecedented collapse in investment. Now, the government didn't want to let this party go without participating. So at the time when private sector investment was falling, they decided that they would cut their own investment portfolio. And as we see, from 8.5 billion in 2008, the new government is going to continue that fall until about 3.5 billion to 2015, about a fall of somewhere between 50 to 60% in real terms. That is what we have to reverse. That is what we have to first stop and then bring back up for us to get on the path of economic recovery, job growth, and fiscal stability. I just want to give a very simple definition of investment. And I'm sorry if it gets so basic, but sometimes in the Irish economic debate, you have to go back to basics. Investment is an outlay of resources, usually money, but an outlay of resources to purchase, create, or upgrade an asset that is intended to generate income in the future. That's all investment is. Now, the problem is the debate over Irish economics in the media is so degraded that we're in danger of falling back into some sort of Paleolithic linguistic. You know, public spending bad, public spending bad, public spending bad. And in that, investment gets thrown in, as if investment is some kind of time-killing, digging and refilling of holes, and it's all part of that waste of money that gets paid to public sector workers, public services, social welfare recipients, and the like. The fact is, whether it's a business that invests to expand its production process, or to invest in new R&D and commercialization to bring out a new product, whether it's a household that invests to put their children into higher education, or indeed a government that invests into a state-of-the-art seaport facilities, it's all intended to generate activity today, generated to create income in the future. In that sense, though an investment strategy, it shares many of the same characteristics as the traditional stimulus program. But it goes one step further, because the traditional stimulus program, at least in the popular consciousness, is private markets break down, consumer spending falls, jobs fall, investment falls. So the state temporarily steps in and replaces all that private sector activity, acts as a substitute, until private sector actors can get back up on their feet, start growing again, and then the state slowly withdraws that stimulus. An investment strategy, though it has many of the same effects, is doing something else. It is intended to upgrade our economic and social infrastructure, to boost productivity, to boost employment, to boost wages, to form new enterprise startups and expand existing enterprise startups, all with the hope that activity today will generate even more activity in the future. And that is an act of state policy. Now, thankfully, one silver lining in the years of full mismanagement is that we have a lot of assets to upgrade. There is no shortage of infrastructural deficits to address. I'll just give you one example. The World Economic Forum, which compiles the Global Competitiveness Index, that's the Davos crowd that meets once a year on some Swiss mountain. They compile a whole range of rankings of countries, and one has to be careful because it's usually a mixture of kind of hard data and subjective data, but actually a lot of this stuff is corroborated by the National Competitiveness Council in Forfos, which also produces reports that show our infrastructural deficits. And as we can see, Ireland is ranked 69th in the world for overall infrastructure. 69th! We are at nearly the bottom of the OECD in terms of physical infrastructure. Roads were 52, rail were 42, there it is. Air transport 52. Here's the hoot. We're ranked 45, an island nation is ranked 45 on seaport infrastructure. There are some landlocked countries that have better seaport infrastructure than Ireland. You really have to work at that. You know, you really have to try. Now that's just the physical infrastructure. Let's never forget, infrastructure is also a social infrastructure, and by that means that's not only just public services, but social protection. And I think it's fair to argue that Irish public services are European in name only, in health and in education, and indeed what Sinead Pentony commented upon regarding the latest OECD findings of income inequality and poverty among the elderly shows the weakness of our social protection infrastructure. So we need to vastly increase investment. Can you let me know when it's 10 minutes, because I don't want to. We vastly need to improve. I would argue that it has to be public-led. Doesn't necessarily all have to come through the exchequer, but it must be public-led. Because, for instance, in many of these cases, the infrastructure is not something that the private sector would want to get involved in. Well, maybe they will. Maybe eventually we will sell off our primary schools, like the example of the Acropolis. It may not be appropriate just at this time. But there's another reason why we should be wary of private sector investment. Davy stockbrokers, they're not affiliated to the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, but they produced this excellent 3.5-page report. I urge everybody to go on their website and read it. It's called Years of Income, High Income Largely Wasted. And what they did was they did a critique of private sector investments between 2000 and 2008. And what they found was that the total capital stock, that's the assets in which has been created by your investment, went up by 255 billion. Biggest increase in the EU. Fantastic. Of course, over 70% of that investment went into, guess what? Housing. Hence our property boom. They estimated that only 50 billion went into, about 20%, went into core productive sectors of the economy, and of that, the public sector accounted for 2/3 of that core productive investment. They called private sector investment pitiful, and they said it was audacious for anybody in Ireland to think that we were as wealthy as similar countries like Belgium and Finland, because we squandered all that high income. So therefore, if we are to use private sector investments, we should put it on a leash before we should let it out of the house. So that's, okay. Now, the good thing is that we can measure economic impact of investment. Again, I come back to this idea because in the debate, it's kind of just seen as money blown away. It's just money spent and doesn't have anything to do with it. Actually, we have measurements of the benefits of investment. There are two ways to measure the impact on the economy from investment. One is the short-term impact. It's called demand side And there's a longer term impact called supply side. The distinction is very simple. If you build a bridge, all the activity that comes from the building of the bridge, the hiring of the people, the sourcing of the materials, the transport, and all that, that's the demand side. And that has an impact on the economy, but of course that's going to waste away once the building construction is done. The supply side is the benefit to the economy from the use of that bridge. And that, of course, is, with investments, should last years and years and years. Now, this calls for a discussion of multipliers, and you can go into a black hole having arguments about multipliers. What I want to do is just feature two studies that have been used here in Ireland. Because again, much of the debate you'll hear saying, oh no, we can't invest, can't do that, because of leakage. And sure, I mean, multipliers from the IMF and the EU and the United States and Canada, they're not relevant to this country. Okay, let's take two studies. One is an historical study by Philip Lane and Augustine Benetrix, two macroeconomists at Trinity. And what they did was they studied the impact of capital investment over a period from 1970 to 2006. So this is a pretty good comprehensive, this captures all the swings and roundabouts of the economy during that period. So this can be considered as an average. They found that for every €1 billion you invest into the economy, on a once-off basis, that first year, the economy will grow by 1.25. The second year, as that money weaves in, will grow by 1.6 billion. Even in the third year, there is still growth, $500 million. And even in the fourth, fifth, and sixth year as it winds down. In other words, a once-off capital investment of €1 billion will, over a 6-year period, create 4 times the benefit of the original outlay. That's why it's called investment, and it lasts for 6 years. That's for government investment. Public service investment is another story. Now this is kind of the impact of what's called non-wage public service investment. Again, in the debate, you hear these attacks on public services. 10 minutes. You hear these attacks on public services, and we have to cut back on public services. And of course, immediately everybody thinks of the underworked, overpaid public sector worker with a gold-plated pension. And sure, we're going to have a go at that. Of course, what these commentators, these experts who know better don't tell you, is that 30 to 40% of our expenditure on public services comes from contracts with the private sector. We purchase goods and services from the private sector. So when we cut back on public services, we may cut back on public sector payroll and public sector wages, we cut back on private sector employment, and we cut back on private sector business activity as well. We find here, through non-wage public service investment from the private sector, the effects are even better. Twice that of your original outlay in the first 2 years, continuing on for that period. That is just the demand side. That will eventually ease out of the economy once that first hit is taken. Well, this is just the jobs multiplier from the Department of Finance. Every €1 billion will create between 8,000 to 12,000 jobs in these particular areas. That's why, of course, you get that boost to the economy, because of all that boost in demand, and it's a hell of a boost in terms of the fiscal benefits. The SRI has done actually work on the supply side impact, and this is even more fascinating, because don't forget, this is the longer term impact when we actually start to consume that asset that we created or purchased or upgraded in terms of, say, education or next generation broadband. This was their evaluation of the NDP program between 2007 and 2013. This builds on assessments that they've done on previous NDP programs and the expenditure of cohesion funds from the EU. Now, what we find here is, that's both GDP, GNP, they're both the same, but a program of investment of about 4 to 4.5% each year for 6 years obviously gives a big boost in the early part, comes down, but actually if you take a look at that, it starts to grow beyond 2020. Investment starting at 2007, the investment starts growing back at 2020. And they claim that beyond 2020, it'll settle somewhere between 2 and 3%. So an outlay of 4 or 4.5% brings you a long-term return of between 2 and 3%. I mean, private enterprises would give their right arm for that type of return. Of course, it depends on the type of investment that you're using. And there are good investments, bad investments, short-term, long-term. That will determine the thing. Now, to save time, I just want to go through it quickly. A lot of these things have been discussed before. What kind of investment? €2.5 billion to roll out next generation broadband to every business and household in this country. Early education and childcare. We are actually ranked at, the OECD ranks us at the bottom as an early education. Green construction, green technologies. We all know about a modern water and waste system. It's terribly expensive to go around band-aiding a 100-year-old water system in many parts of this country. Things like employer of last resort and labor activation measures, and I look forward to Randall's discussion on the jobs guarantee, and of course things like free primary care, both GP and prescription medicine, as part of those investments. All I just say is this: everywhere I go, trade unions, business groups, social and community organizations, local ad hoc groups, it is amazing the amount of creativity that people have in terms of coming up with ideas to promote enterprises, to promote economic activity, promote social activity, which generates real economic and social value added. I mean, it's not the want of ideas or the want of the innovativeness or creativity of people. It's that anytime somebody comes up with an idea, they get met with the same response. Public spending bad, you know. And until we can devise a fiscal framework that can incorporate that creativity and energy, then we will continue to suffer from the economic situation that we find ourselves in. Very briefly, I want to talk about where do we resource this investment. And this will be my final thing. Huh? 5 minutes. Where do we resource the investment? Because obviously we are in an EU IMF bailout deal. I'd like to think that Morgan Kelly was right, that we could somehow get rid of our deficit in 1 year. That's not going to happen, and you wouldn't want to even try because you'd collapse the economy. We have a very limited room for maneuver. I'd just like to make this point. We didn't always have a limited room for maneuver. In 2007, on the eve of the recession, our net debt as a percentage of GDP, net debt means gross debt minus savings in our pension funds and cash balances in the ATMA, was 12%. It was one of the lowest in the EU 15, 12%. Remember when the first things came in about, how we're going to lose money, we've got the recession, we have to start cutting public spending? No one mentioned that we were at 12%. In a matter of 4 years, it's gone up to 95%. That is the legacy of austerity and recapitalizing insolvent banks. Therefore, our room for maneuver is limited. But I would name just a couple of few areas. We still have remaining savings and cash balances, 4 to 5 billion in the pension fund, and though it's a subject for dispute and debate, somewhere between 10 and 13 billion euros in cash balances after the bank recapitalization. We used to have about 45 billion, now we're down probably to about 15. Still, that can start the seed base for an investment drive. As Tom pointed out, promissory notes that we'll be paying, 43 billion up to the year 2025. Whatever about recapitalizing live banks, I cannot see the economic or moral argument for capitalizing a bank which was never really a bank. It was a property investment house, is now under criminal investigation, and it doesn't even have any customers, except for institutional customers that are there to keep it plugged in. It has no private customers. If we could redirect some or all of that money spent on those promissory notes into an investment program, that would achieve the type of growth and job creation that we want. Government's going to come in with a pension levy of 0.5% tomorrow. That seems to be the idea. Why don't we go the whole hog? Why don't we substantially increase it and convert them into bonds, long-term bonds? The pension fund gets the money back. We get access to that money. They get interest. They get an asset. And we get a substantial more amount of money over the long term to invest. There's also the European Investment Bank. There's quantitative easing Irish style. Michael Casey, former chief economist at the central bank and IMF board member, suggests that we actually might have more room for monetary movement through the Irish central bank than we think. Because we've already given 65 to 70 billion to the Irish banks, and no one really knows how that's working. And if anybody thinks that's because of strong collateralized assets, think again, it's of such junk status that not even the ECB would take it. Michael Casey's argument was, why don't we just say that we'll take a fraction of that amount and put it into lending to the government? And of course, public enterprise. We've had a report recently that we should privatize public enterprise. We knew that was coming down the line. I'm surprised it took till 2011 to come up with that one. There was no economic case made for it, no business case made for it. I just make this point. I mean, for years, the trade union movement has said public enterprise is an instrument of growth. It should not matter where enterprise development occurs, whether it's the public sector, the private sector, the cooperative sector. We need more enterprise development. I'll just leave you this one thing. In the onboard SNP report that was published in 2009, it was mooted. This is always the classic teeing up argument, that the government should consider privatizing Bord na Móna. That was in the onboard SNP report. Interestingly, that week, Bord na Móna announced that they were creating 450 new jobs. That is the distinction between those who have no other case to privatize public enterprise except an insipid ideological case, and those who see public enterprise as a vehicle for economic growth. So, and I'll just conclude with this. The idea is to create a fiscal package of investment, given the limitations that we're operating in the EU-IMF deal, to come up with what the ESRI summarized with the NDP program, whereby you have the demand side impact, which is short of nature but substantial, which can help get things moving, getting that whole confidence thing going, all that, and at the same time, you are overlaying that with the use of those assets that you've created through investment that provides a long-term return to the economy. That is the alternative to the economics of austerity. It's predicated on growth and employment, but also it's predicated on one simple thing, a belief that through collective action, we can resolve the economic and social crisis that was not started by people, but was started by finance capital. Thank
you. This is just one policy focused on what to do about labor markets and unemployment problems. And it's one of the applications of modern money theory. It's a program that is opened up as a possibility if you have sovereign currency. Although I will talk about what you might do in your current situation. So here's an overview. First I'll address the causes of unemployment, what are proper goals for a sovereign government, the costs of unemployment and the benefits of employment, how the job guarantee works in theory. I probably won't have much time to talk about the job guarantee in practice. I actually studied one particular program. Full employment and economic growth, what are the relations between those, job guarantee for Ireland, and full employment versus nonsense. Okay, first, the cause of unemployment. There are two causes of unemployment. There are the short-run events that cause unemployment, and then there are long-run causes of unemployment. And this program is designed to resolve both of these kinds of unemployment problems. So first, on short-run unemployment, obviously when you have an economic crisis, the unemployment rate goes sky high. So here is some data from Ireland. I'm just pointing out that even in the best of times, and even using only the official unemployment rates, you still have significant unemployment. Okay, you get down to 4%, which compared to other capitalist countries, it is a relatively low unemployment rate. I don't know about the situation in Ireland, but usually in the US, you triple the official number to get close to what the true unemployment rate is. If that were true here, in the best of times, maybe you have 12% true unemployment and 4% measured unemployment rates. So even in the best of times, there's a lot of unemployment. So the short run, we do see the cyclical nature, but we never really get to full employment, okay, over the course of a business cycle. Now, in the long run, we have unemployment that results from for two different reasons. The first is that unemployment actually is a policy tool. You would think that policy fights against unemployment and tries to achieve full employment, but of course that is not true, especially since the early 1970s, most countries around the world abandoned the goal of full employment and instead adopted the use of unemployment as a policy tool to achieve price stability. So unemployment came to be seen not as a problem, but as a solution. We will use unemployment to fight inflation, and this is the Phillips curve Nauru trade-off. So policy purposely creates demand gaps to fight inflation. In addition, we have structural unemployment, and I just have a long quote from the ILO here, because they recognize that this structural unemployment problem has been increasing over time. And the burden of unemployment is not equally shared. Typically, you can walk into any country and it doesn't take you more than a few days to figure out which groups are going to be the high unemployment groups. It's never equally shared, and typically white males have, especially college-educated white males, have very low unemployment rates. They don't suffer from the structural unemployment. It's targeted to other groups. In 2007, and again, this is just to point out, even in the best of times, so 2007 was at the peak of the global business cycle boom. ILO estimated there are 200 million unemployed in spite of strong economic growth around the globe. Every region has to face major labor market challenges, it said, and it noted that the relatively good economic growth period had raised productivity growth, which had increased by 26%, but it didn't create many jobs. It only increased jobs by 16.6%. So this is a continuing problem. It was, for the economists here who read David Ricardo, he referred to it as the machine problem. That is, we're replacing human labor with machines. There's also the famous Domar problem and so on that we could talk about. The problem is that with growth of productivity, we don't create enough jobs to keep pace with the growing labor force. Okay, what should the goals of a sovereign government be? As I talked about this morning, a sovereign government has the fiscal capacity to ensure continuous use, full use of domestic resources. If there are any unemployed resources, including labor, a sovereign government can always afford to put them to use, okay? Economic growth by itself is not enough to ensure you get full employment. So the typical Keynesian response to an unemployment problem is, let's just grow the economy faster. Now, I know in this audience, I don't have to convince you that economic growth is not an appropriate goal of government. But I'm saying, even if what you're trying to do actually is to create the jobs, economic growth doesn't create sufficient number of jobs, in addition to maybe destroying the environment. So this is not the right way to achieve full employment. I do think that full employment should be a primary goal rather than economic growth. I also think that price stability, reasonable price stability, is also an appropriate goal of government. Populations do not like inflation. No matter how much an economist can try to explain to the population that as long as your wages are increasing with the price increases, you really shouldn't matter. People do care about inflation. And so I think that a reasonable price stability is an appropriate goal of government. How can we achieve these two things? Full employment and price stability. Now, orthodox economics has been teaching, at least since the early 70s, that these are incompatible. You cannot have full employment and price stability. In fact, we use unemployment to give us price stability. Okay? So what we tried to do is come up with a policy that can achieve full employment on a particular definition, I admit, but without causing inflation. How can we do that? The job guarantee is our policy. Now first, I wanted to look at the costs of unemployment, the benefits of employment. Again, in this audience, unlike when I'm talking to orthodox economists, I don't have to tell you unemployment has huge costs, okay? In addition to the normal economic costs of the lost output, of not fully utilizing your resources, there are huge social costs that are, by any reasonable accounting, very much bigger than the lost output. Note that the lost output is lost forever. Okay, if you have a spell of 9% unemployment for 5 or 6 years, you're not going to get that output back. But you also have huge, lasting social costs. Okay, and you may not be able to recover from these, at least for the impacted population. So I don't need to go through the list, and I'm sure I left some things out. Now, the benefits of full employment. Again, of course you get the goods and services that the workers produce when they're employed. You also get on-the-job training and skill development. That is probably where a very large part of skills are developed, and maybe the majority of skills are developed on the job, rather than through the schooling system and so on. Alleviate poverty. My professor, Hyman Minsky, had done calculations for the US, and I think Stephanie and I repeated these for about 30 years later. We showed you just providing a minimum wage job, one job, to each family would eliminate 2/3 to 3/4 of all poverty in the United States. Okay, and probably something similar to that would occur here. It's not that the minimum wage actually pays a poverty line wage. There is other income coming in to the family too, but you add that one job and you can get them out of poverty. Community building, social networking, and so on. There also is this concept of social multipliers, that we could add up all the benefits that I've listed here, and the total benefit is even greater than that, because there are multiplied effects of each one of these things individually when we take them combined. Okay, the job guarantee in theory, instead of using unemployment to stabilize prices, that harkens back to the old Marxian idea, reserve army of the unemployed, which was used all the time by Greenspan. He didn't give credit to Marx, but he talked all the time about the beneficial impacts of having a reserve army of unemployed out there. Our idea is that instead you use an employed buffer stock rather than an unemployed buffer stock as an inflation fighting tool. Okay, and this is called the job guarantee. It's an unconditional offer of a public job at the minimum wage to anyone who wants to work. Okay, it's universal and it's permanent. Anyone who wants to work is guaranteed a job offer, and the program is permanent. It's not just to deal with the recession, because remember, we're dealing with short-term unemployment problems and long-term unemployment problems. You maintain continuous full employment, again, on the definition that there is a job available to anyone who's willing to work at the program wage. It will resolve both short-term and long-term unemployment problems. Now, an objection that we always get is that, yeah, but there are many people who would not want to work at the program wage. This is true, okay? And you probably don't want to leave college-educated people unemployed or facing the choice of taking a basic wage and working in this program. So you probably need other labor market policies. Okay, so this resolves one of the labor market problems, which is that we never generate enough jobs to satisfy the demand of everyone who wants to work. So there always will be a job, but it still doesn't resolve all labor market problems. Now, we advocate a fixed wage with a basket of benefits that are provided in the program, and probably you start the program at something close to your minimum wage and minimum set of benefits that are provided. Exactly where you set this wage is going to be determined after an economic evaluation and a political discussion. What we would prefer to say is that the wage and benefit package should be at a living wage. That should be the goal. Politically, you may not be able to get that when you implement the program, because the fear is always going to be that right now you have the private sector paying many workers well below a living wage. They're paying a legal minimum wage, it's not a living wage. And if this program comes in with a living wage, those workers are going to leave the private sector, go into this program until the private sector increases all wages to the living wage. Now, maybe all of us in this audience would welcome that. I would. Politically, it's going to be very difficult. So it's less, it has less of an impact on the private sector, and it's less of a political problem if you come in the beginning with a minimum wage and then you strive to increase it over time to a living wage. Okay, so that is why we generally say start with a minimum wage. The key is that once you have set it, wherever you set it, you leave it there until the Parliament or the Congress decides to increase it again through legislation in the same way that you increase minimum wages today. In other words, the government doesn't try to compete with the private sector by bidding wages up in order to attract people into the program. The reason you want to have a fixed wage is because it becomes the base wage. It acts as a price floor. It's the wage floor. No wages in the private sector are going to fall below the wage floor because workers can always move into this program rather than stay in the private sector. When you have a recession, okay, I'll speed up. When you have a recession and workers are laid off in the private sector, they come into this program, so their wages cannot fall below the wage in this program. So it stabilizes wages by setting a price floor. Like any other price floor, like any other buffer stock program, a wage floor does not push wages and prices up. It catches workers as they're falling down. This is why this program achieves full employment without inflation. Okay, it's not going to generate wage inflation because you don't chase wages up. You get full employment and price stability. This also helps to promote currency stability because effectively the value of your currency is going to be determined by what people have to do to get it. To get currency, okay, say it's €8 an hour, workers have to work an hour to get €8. Effectively, that's the value of the currency. Okay? Now, floating rate, it's going to fluctuate around this value. It's not going to stay stable at that equivalent in terms of other currencies, but it is going to help stabilize the value of the currency. Spending in the program will be cyclical, because when the private sector is downsizing, workers flow into this program, government spending on the program increases. So it's automatically going to increase in recession. In an expansion, it automatically shrinks because workers are hired out of the pool. It's a high quality anchor. It works better than the reserve army of the unemployed because people are showing up to work every day. They have a record of work that can be offered to employers. It's a better place to recruit new workers than is a reserve army of the unemployed where people are possibly developing bad habits and can't prove that they're ready and willing to work. People in this program prove they're ready and willing to work. And finally, it helps to stabilize wage income and therefore consumption, which again adds to the automatic stabilizer effect. Okay, additional benefits. It reduces hiring costs, and it provides on-the-job training so that, again, employers can recruit out of the pool. In practice, I'll skip over this. If anyone's interested, I can talk to you on a break or something about Argentina, which we studied in detail. They did implement a job guarantee program. It was somewhat more limited than what we advocate, but it did have the beneficial impacts that we thought it would have, not only on the economy, but also socially. So I can talk about that. Okay, growth by itself is not an appropriate goal. It doesn't create enough jobs. It can promote rising inequality, which is what we've seen over the last decade, and it can harm the environment. Full employment through a job guarantee shares prosperity It can be environmentally sustainable because you can have green jobs, and you get growth with price and currency stability. Okay, now what can Ireland do? Currently, you don't have a sovereign currency, so you don't have an unlimited capacity to fund this program. What that means is you do have to worry about your commitment, financial commitment to the program. So what you will need to do is budget a particular amount for the program, and then you've got to constrain the size of the program. You can't offer a universal job guarantee if you don't have a sovereign currency. You could still operate a limited job guarantee, let's say for urban youth, which is done by many countries. Okay, if you wanted to move to a universal program, what are your options? One is you could abandon the euro. Okay, and then you could do it tomorrow. You could start the program tomorrow if you had your own currency. Let's say you don't want to do that. I was asked, what would Louisiana do? You go to the national government. In your case, you're going to have to go to either the ECB or the European Parliament. You're going to say, we need a job guarantee, and so does Portugal, so does Greece, and so on. Many European countries need a job guarantee. The funding is going to have to come from either the ECB or the European Parliament. A good way to do it would be to have the program highly decentralized so that you don't give up some measure of your political sovereignty. The ECB or EU Parliament only provides the funding, and they could do it on a per capita basis. They could say, okay, we will give each member state 10,000 euros per year per capita to run a program like this. Okay? What are the advantages? Or how would you, actually this is more along the lines, how would you implement it? Assuming either your own currency, I gotta finish? Euro. Okay, or you get the funding from the EU. Probably you want to decentralize. I really liked what Michael was saying about the creativity. You want to use the creativity, especially of your not-for-profit sector. What Argentina did is they said, look, if anyone has a good proposal for how you would use workers, we will pay the wages, you come up with the projects. They accepted all proposals, and then they funded the wages for the good proposals. So that way you decentralize the program, you decentralize the management of the workers in the program, and the central government only provides the funding for the wages in the program and possibly some of the material costs. Okay, let me just see the final quote. My favorite quote from Keynes. The conservative belief that there is some law of nature that prevents you from employing and that it would be financially unsound to put people to work, he says, is crazily improbable. The sort of thing that only someone who's been trained in neoclassical economics could see as rational, because actually it's nonsense. Thanks.
And we propose in Smart Taxes, which is led by FASTA, the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. So FASTA put the bid in and essentially Smart Taxes won the bid, and we had a 3-year contract to develop policy ideas. And part of our bid and what we do is we made a particular effort to break out of our little silo, our green people, people who always agree with us, where we feel comfortable and where we get nowhere. We accurately predicted the prices, both of the property crisis and the banking crisis, and we rather naively assumed that when it all happened that they would look to us. The Green Party was in power for advice. That did not happen. And the reason why it didn't happen is, even though we have a well-articulated critique of the money system and the banking system and the impetus on growth, it is not respectable. And when I mean respectable, I mean we've been out of the mainstream. Our writers are popular. They've developed a strong grassroots following, but they have not got any linkages or overlaps with third-level, peer-reviewed critique. And part of the reason why that didn't happen is that it's very difficult to work in that world where your ideas are different. That is why we are so grateful that Randall Ray and Bill Black and Stephanie and Bill Mitchell and others stuck it out there. And it can't have been easy. In the respectable world, perhaps losing the respect of their peers, persisting, getting the research together, backing it up with the facts. And they did that quietly, I believe, over the last 10 years, while we were developing a grassroots movement, and I think an important grassroots movement. So when this whole thing happened, it offered the opportunity, and we had for the first time ever a little bit of money, to bring together the MMT people, the people who are respectable just about barely, they're barely respectable there, and some of the ideas that we've developed in the green sector, which are, let's face it, a bit fuzzy. And I think together, and then working indeed with the progressive sector, that's seen itself in a way as at the vanguard of new ideas. We don't always agree with that, but certainly with their heart in the right place and with the same kind of motivation as the green sector, that together, at last, perhaps, the opportunity was there to put together a thought-out, well-argued, well-articulated, consistent framework of the way the money system works now, and apply it to certainly the progressive analysis, the need for our economy to deliver on social goals, and in the environmental sector's need and indeed overwhelming objective to preserve the environment in which everything else takes place. So this was our first attempt at that. And I'm glad to see that actually there is a lot of overlap. On consensus, we've consensus on really important things. For instance, that we're insolvent, that the bail-in of the banks, that the bail-in, I think, was a good idea, has to happen. The separation of this private debt from the public sector, that separation has to occur, however it occurs. We have certainly agreement that investment is needed in infrastructure, that is agreed. We are both agreed that the answer really is in spending and government spending of some kind. Now, where there still are grey areas and areas of discussion are essentially, we feel the worst is yet to come. I think the progressive sector still is looking positively to the future by extrapolating from the past. We're a bit more worried about the future than possibly progressives. There's no doubt. We have to discuss that, we have to analyse that, and we have to share more information. That money is not a constraint. This we sort of knew in the green sector. MMT confirms this. Money is not a constraint. Resources are a constraint. Our social capital is a constraint. Money is not a constraint if you're sovereign, or indeed even if you've courage to take your sovereignty back, it's not a constraint. We have other real problems that we should be dealing with. And there are real constraints and difficulties. Money doesn't solve everything once indeed we do realise that we have that possibility to create and use it usefully. The best pension is our young people. I think we've broadly agreed on that, but I haven't seen it fully articulated that the scourge of emigration has to stop. That is our best pension. The Green Job Guarantee, a lot of discussion there. The Job Guarantee offers the green sector the possibility of an immediate mobilised army to tackle the issue of oil peak and climate change. And that is very attractive. And the thing about that is that it will not compete in any way with the public or private sector, because nobody is doing it. It's not going to take anybody's job away. And we know in the NGO sector, it'll take a little time, but we could ramp that up. And that is extraordinarily attractive to us. And it's attractive enough to bring a lot of green people who will not normally sit through an economics lecture, and I know this as one of the few sort of economically oriented environmentalists. It is extraordinarily difficult to get environmentalists to sit down and try and understand why they should know about these things. But the Green Job Guarantee is a wonderful motivation to do that, and we're going to work on that. The other thing is, and yes, we agree on investment. There is a division here, still. Partly progressive still want to invest for growth. Growth may happen, but what we really want to do is invest for resilience, because indeed we're more pessimistic about the future. But they're not big disagreements. So what I want to do now here is look for help. Our funding is not guaranteed for our third year, and it is very small, really, in the end of the day. We rely, we took a decision that much of our money is spent on research contracts. We keep our own employment levels down. We use a lot of voluntary labor. We need more economists working with us. So whether they come from, I see we have one economics student. I hope there are others. We need more economists to take these ideas and start working them out in the Irish context, taking on board the environmental issues as well as the well-articulated progressive issues, social issues that have to be taken on board. So basically, I want to thank you all for coming. I'm not sure what we're going to do next. We work on other things as well, but this is our highest priority, and we haven't really thought beyond it, beyond saying we need help. And we work by steering committee. At the moment, our steering committee is comprised really entirely of environmentalists. We like having other outsiders. So even if you disagree with many aspects of the green movement, but you are attracted about the idea of MMT, we would invite you to join our steering group and contribute to decisions about what's the next thing we should do. Thank you.